You know how the usual cycle of buying an expensive car goes. You save up for months or take out a loan or credit card to buy the car. Then you show it off to your friends and family. You drive it around for a while and you take good care of it. Then one day you dump it somewhere and walk away, leaving it to get rusty and fall to pieces. Does that last part sound strange to you? It probably should. Yet people do it all the time, as you're about to see. Our first car is a beautiful 1970 Plymouth Superbird. And looking at it now, you'd never believe that it went through a single day of neglect in its entire existence. That's not the case though. It looks like this today because it's been fully restored. The car was bought almost brand new in 1971, driven for 2 years, then parked in a field behind the owner's grandmother's house and left there, exposed to the elements, for 15 years. A new owner came along to take it in 1988 and intended to perform the necessary restoration work himself, but he quickly ran out of time and money. The car was once again abandoned, this time in the darkness of a garage for more than 20 years. A third owner was finally found for the stricken vehicle in 2017, and he spent 2 years getting it back into shape. Because many of the internal fittings as possible have been retained, including the bucket seat, now it's in mint condition again, and it's thought to be worth $250,000. Our next car is also a Plymouth Superbird, and one with a fine racing pedigree. Back in the early days of NASCAR, it wasn't uncommon for cars to go missing after their racing days were over, even if they just so happened to be driven by Richard Petty. This distinctive bright blue bird was driven by Petty in 1970, but retired from racing the following season and disposed of as if it were nothing. Back then, people weren't as aware that old cars might grow in value as they are today. The unwanted cars were sold or scrapped, so this one might have been lost entirely. Fortunately, it turned up in the hands of a classic car enthusiast, Todd Warner, in 2017. Todd suspected that the old wreck which he'd acquired cheaply might be a Petty Superbird and sought confirmation from Petty Enterprises. They checked the chassis and engine markings and quickly confirmed that the ailing Superbird was a genuine article. The company was almost as excited as Todd himself was, so they helped him get the car back into the same condition it was when he took it to the speedways 50 years ago. Why have one abandoned car when you can have a whole 300? We don't want to say that this is the greatest barn find of all time, but it has to come close. The vehicles were discovered in a dusty lockup in New York City in early 2020, where a private collector had been hoarding them for decades. Most of the cars, which are thick with dust from years of hiding in the shadows, have fewer than 1,000 miles on the clock. Going through a list of everything that's here would be exhausting, but here are a few of the highlights. There's a 1974 Hearst Oldsmobile, a Matra Jet 5, a two-door Cadillac Seville, and a Packard Hearst that looks like it was once a genuine funeral car. The collection wouldn't be complete without a Plymouth Superbird, and so of course there's one here, lifted above the floor on a rack not far from a Bizzarini P538 race car. The racer is only one of 6 ever built and is worth more than $1 million on its own. The Lamborghini LM002 across the floor from it was once owned by movie star Nicolas Cage. Why build a collection like this just to hide it? The Dodge Charger Daytona was never really meant to be a road car. 560 units of the vehicle were built, but that was only to homologate the vehicle for NASCAR purposes. As hard as it might be to imagine today, back in 1969, they were thought to be ugly cars. Part of that was due to their length. From nose to tail, the Daytona is 18 feet long. You need a barn to store a car that large, and a barn is exactly where this model spent over 40 years prior to its discovery in 2015. Charlie Lyons, who owns a Chrysler restoration shop in Alabama, was stunned when he heard rumors of an old Daytona hiding on farmland barely 5 miles from his home. The rumors were true, though, and Lyons was able to acquire the vehicle at a knockdown price from the farm's owners. Apparently, the owner had bought it when he was young to drive to spring break decades ago, mostly because he wanted to impress girls. That's also why he painted flames onto the sides. Charlie has tuned the vehicle up and got it running since buying it, and now intends to sell it for something like $180,000. Now we move from one Dodge Charger to another. At least the last example we looked at had been kept inside a barn during its time off the road. This one has been left outside for at least 20 years with no protection other than a little cover that's afforded by the treetops. Here's a testament to how well the vehicles were built, though. After no more than 10 minutes attention from a qualified mechanic, the engine sputtered to life, and the Mopar was up and running again. Nobody really knows the real backstory behind this blue Charger, other than the fact that it had been sitting for a very long time, and that all attempts to trace its owner had failed. When nobody else cared for it, the same mechanic who got the engine running is now taking it away and parked it in his own driveway, where it'll get a little more attention. The tires are new and the engine is running, but based on these images, it looks like the body could do with some work as well. Sticking with the theme of beautiful cars of the 1960s, here's a 1966 Shelby GT350H that spent most of its life abandoned in a yard in Ohio, USA. The vintage muscle car hadn't moved since the early 1980s and has stood in the same place for such a long time that it had begun to sink into the ground. The rescue team that turned up to salvage it was so unsure that it could be saved that they had to get a lawyer to draw up documents absolving them from blame if the Shelby disintegrated as they tried to tow it away. The fender was hanging off, the paint was cracked and bubbled, but even with all the decay, the iconic black body with gold stripes was enough to provide a hint of how beautiful the car must have been back when it was in its prime. Sadly, we don't have any post-restoration photos to show you. The car was recovered in February 2020, so the necessary work is still ongoing. It's likely to cost tens of thousands of dollars to do the job properly, but with a car like this, could fetch over $150,000 in good condition. It's still likely that its current owners will be able to turn a profit on it once all the process is complete. Often you have to know a thing or two about classic cars to appreciate their value, even when they're in a dilapidated state. How many people would understand that this Mercedes-Benz 300 SL was worth almost $1 million even in this sorry rusted state? The chrome is faded, the engine's worn out, and the upholstery's been shredded, but at some point in the distant past, someone must have loved this old roadster. It has over 75,000 miles on the clock. If the car were in good condition, it'd likely sell on the open market for about $1.5 million. So perhaps the $800,000 that its new owner parted with in order to acquire it isn't such a bad investment after all. The Beverly Hills Car Club of California handled the sale and said that it's so rare for this type of Mercedes to appear for sale that there's an insanely high demand for them, even when the damage that's been done to the car is so obvious. Hopefully, this car will be beautiful again one day. If you took a look at this 1968 Dodge Coronet RT from a distance, you might not think the condition it's in is too bad. Perhaps you might even imagine that you could pick up the keys and drive it away. Only when you get closer do you realize that all the glass is missing from the frames of the doors and windshield. Nobody knows quite how long it sat forgotten in a barn in Little Rock, Arkansas, USA for, but based on the state of the decay, we'd have to assume that it's been a few decades. Aside from the missing glass, some of the lower hanging metal details on the Mopar have rusted away to nothingness. There are still a few details worthy of note though. Under the rust, there are chrome exhaust tips, a stylized power bulge on the hood, and original badges. The engine, however, is sadly not the original. It's also missing the intake where the 4-barrel carburetor is supposed to go, so it's likely that insects or other creatures might have taken up residence in there. As it's almost always the case with barn finds, it's going to take a lot of work to get this Coronet back to its best. Not every case of car abandonment is down to thoughtlessness. Sometimes the owner of a car might pass away and there's nobody left behind to take care of their assets. That was the case for this 1960 Austin Healey 3000. It was bought brand new in its year of release, but its owner passed away just 8 years later, and nobody in their family picked up the chore of looking after the car. That meant that it spent the next 50 years exposed to the elements in Ontario. The flip side of it being abandoned for such a long time after such a short period of ownership, though, is that every detail of the car is original. Nothing has been replaced, and the interior is surprisingly in good condition. It's believed that the hardtop is rare, and so even if the floors need to be replaced after all this time, the hardtop is enough to give the car a 5-figure value if it can be salvaged. The paint is tired, to say the least, but the chrome twin is still attached, and it's not impossible to imagine that the engine might still run if a skilled mechanic gets their hands on it. Finding a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427 in a barn would be something to write home about. Finding that same Shelby parked up right next to a 1966 Ferrari 275 GTB2 is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and that event happened in 2018. The cars were discovered together in North Carolina with a sad story behind them. When the original owner passed away, he left them to a mechanic who he trusted to look after them. Unfortunately, the mechanic then passed away in 1991, and the cars became abandoned in his barn. His family then stored junk around the vehicles without realizing how valuable they are. The Ferrari only has 13,000 miles on the clock, and the Cobra, fitted with a rare 428 cubic inch police interceptor engine, has barely traveled any farther at 19,000 miles. They've both seen a few mice and insect infestations over the years, but that didn't stop them from selling for $4 million as a pair when they went to auction. That price was based on them being in their current condition. Who knows how much more they might be worth when they've had a little refurbishment work performed. We're going even further back in time for our next barn discovery. It's a 1930 Franklin 147 Speedster. This model of car was noted at the time of its creation as one of the first to come with an air-cooled engine. The Franklin Company ceased trading in the 1950s, which might be about the time that this old Speedster was parked in a garage in Georgia, USA, and then abandoned. It appears that someone once started to perform some restoration work on it, but gave up before completing it. That doesn't surprise us. Performing an authentic restoration on a car this old is very difficult because the parts simply don't exist. The cost would be enormous. Despite the thick coating of rust, the engine still runs and the car can be driven, although in this state it isn't approved for use on the road. We also suspect that sitting inside it wouldn't be very comfortable because of all the exposed, rusted metal. For the right collector, though, the sale of this car would be a unique opportunity to own a rare piece of motoring history. Being stored in a barn isn't always a guarantee that a car will start to rot away. If the storage conditions are right, it can be maintained in almost good as new condition for decades. We certainly can't see any evidence of corrosion or damage to this 1958 Chevrolet Corvette unless you count the questionable decision to paint it green. Those of you who are in the know about such things might be interested to hear that this is a Healey. The fact that it's so well preserved might be due to the fact that it's only ever had 2 careful owners, the most recent of whom confirmed that it's been parked up since 1979 for no reason other than the fact that he bought another Corvette and preferred it to this one. While the exterior looks pristine, it's fair to say that the interior's going to need a little work, since that's a small detail to worry about when the 290 horsepower fuel-injected engine still turns over and the car can be driven away as soon as it was bought. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.